So our learning will serve as an introduction to the learning of Mishnayot Masechet Sukkah, which we're going to do over the course of these next weeks. Hopefully you've seen in the bulletin and in various emails the schedule, but it will basically be all the following Mondays and Thursdays, except when they are themselves Hagim, all the way through Sukkot. And on the second day of Sukkot, I hope everyone will be able to join us in Shul. For those who are, we'll make a siyum on Mishnayot Masechet Sukkah. Just a reminder that as we go through, and each week, Monday or Thursday's classes, we'll be learning one perek per session. We won't actually read through and discuss every Mishnah. So if you want to really get to cover all of that, our encouragement is to either use Sefaria online or another online resource or a hard copy book of Mishnah and try to study each chapter on its own in advance of or after each session. What we'll do in each session, which will cover one perek, one chapter, will be to draw out some of the highlights, themes, key ideas, and maybe zero in on a couple of the Mishnayot from within that chapter. So my goal for today is to give a little bit of an overview of what is the content of Mishnayot Masechet Sukkah for a few minutes. And then, as I said, I want to argue for the centrality of Sukkot as a culmination of two interrelated but also independent holiday cycles within the Jewish calendar. And I hope that that will help give us some insight into how we approach the different topics in Mishnayot Masechet Sukkah. Great. I'll pause for a moment if anyone has initial questions about what this series is going to be. It's going to be taught by all members of the rabbinic team, although we won't get to learn from Rav Avi, but we'll have other opportunities over Elul and Tishrei to do so. And it will include at the end 2 sessions on practical halacha of building a sukkah and of the 4 species, and again conclude with our siyum in shul on the second day of Sukkot. So any questions about the learning over the next month or so? Great. Okay. So a couple of facts and basic content or context for Masechet Sukkah. First of all, a little situating and reminders about Mishnah in general. Mishnah is compiled by Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi, generally considered to be a 4th or 5th generation Tana. So he's really at the end of the period of the Tanaim, going really from the turn of the Common Era to around 200 of the Common Era. And these are the figures who lived at the end of the Second Temple period and into the early post-Temple period. Some of the famous names that we may come across alongside Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi, Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Akiva, Rabbi Meir. These are some of the prominent names in the Mishnah. And Mishnah, is really the core, it's the heart in many ways of Torah Shebaal Peh, of the oral law, although it ultimately gets written down, of course. And it serves as we know, the springboard to the Talmud. The Talmud really is a set of discussions and expansions on the text of the Mishnah, putting it into conversation with other texts that didn't make it into the Mishnah from that same time period, Braitot, Toseftot, other comparable texts, and trying to pull them together, put them into discussion with how things were actually being practiced, explicate the usually very terse debates in the Mishnah, and try to understand them better. So the Mishnah really serves as the springboard for the development of oral law and rabbinic law, which ultimately branches out into many directions, one of which is halachic codes. And we'll see in Mishnah Masechet Sukkah both practical halacha, a little bit of parable, story, a little bit of quoting psukim, which the Mishnah doesn't do very often. In fact, the lion's share of what the Gemara's work is about in many ways is to try to draw out the psukim and the Torah sources that the Mishnah seems to be basing itself on. And so we'll see only a very few actual Torah psukim reflected in the Mishnah, but we'll always be asking ourselves, what's the Torah source? And in fact, as I'll explicate a little bit more in a minute, The Mishnah really in Masechet Sukkah deals with 4 topics. 2 of them are very clearly talked about in the Torah, and 2 of them are not talked about in the Torah. And the sort of interrelationship between those 2 pairs of topics is interesting in its own right. So that's a little bit about Mishnah in general, a review, a reminder. There are 6 orders, Sidarim of Mishnah. The first one is Zera'im, which primarily deals with agriculture. The second one is Moed, which deals with holidays. Moed has the most, and that's where Masechet Sukkah is found. Moed has the most tractates of all. It has 12 tractates. First one is Shabbat. That's very, very lengthy. The second is Eruvin, deals with carrying on Shabbat primarily, and how and when that can be done, and the structure of Eruv structures that enable carrying in smaller or larger areas. Then the third is Tractate Psachim, which deals with Passover. The fourth, Shkalim, issues of kind of coinage and the Machatzita shekel. Then the fifth is Masechet Yoma, which deals with Yom Kippur. The sixth, right in the middle of Seder Moed, is Tractate Sukkah, what we're going to be learning. It has 5 chapters. The general arrangement of tractates doesn't follow the holiday order or the importance of the holidays or the length of the holidays. It follows actually the length of the tractates themselves. So from longest to shortest. So Shabbat being the longest comes first, then Eruvin, then Psachim, Shkalim, then Yoma, and then Sukkah. And then the even smaller tractates follow. Beitzah about the laws of Yom Tov, Rosh Hashanah, you can guess what it's about. Tanit about the laws of various fasts. Megillah about the laws of customs of Purim. Moed Katan about Chol HaMoed. And Chagiga, which has other holiday, festival, and temple-related laws, and actually brings the conclusion is those last 2 are very short tractates, just 3 chapters and about 20-something Mishnayot. Sukkah, which is 5 chapters long, contains 53 Mishnayot spread over those 5 chapters, so you can get a sense about 10 Mishnayot per chapter. The content of Masechet Sukkah, which is what we're going to learn over the coming weeks, I'll just give you a quick, broad overview. The first chapter, and by the way, for bibliography purposes, a wonderful book to learn Mishnah at a kind of 30,000 feet level is this volume called Mishnah Sdura. It's in Hebrew, but I'll give you just a little glimpse inside. It has lots of Mishnayot on one page. A typical Mishnah edition, like the Albeck, which I have here, has, you can see, kind of just a few Mishnayot on the top and lots of commentary on the bottom. One of the most popular editions of Mishnayot, the Kahati. Similarly, in the larger print, you see has just a couple of Mishnayot and lots of commentary on the bottom. But when you want to cover a lot of ground, or you're reviewing, or you want to see maybe the larger structure of Mishnayot, it helps to see a lot of them on one page. And that's what this Mishnah Sudura volume does. So you can see that Masechet Sukkah, which is 5 chapters, basically starts here, and it takes up only 1 double page, 2 double pages, 3 double pages, and that's the end of Masechet Sukkah. So in 6 pages, you get all of Mishnayot Masechet Sukkah with very, very minimal commentary at the bottom, just clarifying a few unclear words. And what the Mishnah Sdura has in the back is a very cool kind of chart that will give you the overview of the topics in any tractate. And so what it describes for us, which we'll see as we learn, is that the 2 mitzvot that we're most familiar with and that we'll see in the Torah as the heart of Masechet, of the holiday of Sukkot, the mitzvah of building and dwelling in a sukkah, and the mitzvah of taking the arba minim, the 4 species, those occupy the beginning of the tractate. The first chapter and the second chapter deal with the mitzvah of sukkah itself. The first chapter and a half, basically, what makes a kosher or non-kosher sukkah, dimension, size, the schach, etc. And then the second half of chapter 2 deals with the laws of dwelling in the sukkah. Who is obligated? What do we need to do inside the sukkah? What can we do outside the sukkah on Sukkot? That takes us to the end of chapter 2. chapter 3, which is the longest, 15 Mishnayot, deals with the 4 species themselves. First half of the chapter deals with what makes them kosher or pasul for use, if they're dried out, if they're, don't look sufficiently beautiful, if there are some kinds of blemishes or lacking in the various species, species by species. And then the second half of the chapter goes through how they are actually employed or deployed. How does one hold, bind, utilize, shake the Arba Minim as we do on Sukkot? That takes us through the first 3 chapters. Again, those are the parts of Sukkot that we're familiar with. Chapters 4 and 5 focus on Sukkot as it was celebrated in temple times. First, how were the Arba Minim taken in the temple, and how was it different between the temple and the rest of the country in the time when the temple stood. A special custom of putting the Aravot against the altar in the temple that took place, and then the special Simchat Beit HaShoeva, the water drawing festival and special water libations that were a part of the Sukkot holiday. That's what the chapters 4 and then 5 deal with, and end with a few assorted laws that have to do with the temple at large. And so really the first 3 chapters will deal with topics that are more familiar to us. Chapters 4 and 5 will be a little bit new and different, although you hear echoes of these ideas of doing something special with some of the species against the central part of the temple or synagogue will bear some similarity to a contemporary custom. And certainly today we have celebrations on Chol HaMoed Sukkot often that we call Simchat Beit HaShoeva, various kinds of dancing and other gathering and celebrating in the Sukkah. So we'll be learning about its predecessor holiday that was especially celebrated in temple times. So it's interesting to see the parts that are still applicable today and the parts that are no longer practiced in the same way, but still have echoes today. What's interesting that I'll just note for a moment now is that the second half of the tractate still maintains in the discussion of the temple things that were done with the 4 species. What sort of disappears in the second half of the tractate is the Sukkah itself. And we might come back to thinking about why that might be the case. I saw a comment in the chat, so let me just go there for a moment. Teddy, do you want to unmute and just clarify your question?
Yeah, which book are you, is it you showed a book that had English that was easy to follow. Could you just show us the title of the book?
Oh, so this book, unfortunately, the books that I showed today did not have English. This is called Mishnah Sedura, and it has, lots of Mishnayot on one page, but this book is all Hebrew. The Kahati Mishnayot, and I'll type that into the chat, Kahati Mishnayot are available in English, and that's an excellent commentary on the Mishnah that I highly recommend. And there is actually a Hebrew English Kahati app, which you can get. I know it's available on iPhone. I'm not sure about Androids. And if you want to do Mishnah studying on your phone, I think the Kahati Mishnah app is great. There's also an app, I think it's called All Mishnah, which is a great resource. I'll mention here, and some of you may be familiar as well, that in December, the world started a new cycle of Mishnah Yomi or Yomit, which is actually modeled after the Daf Yomi cycle. It's a study of 2 Mishnayot a day. And just like the Daf Yomi cycle, it's set up on a calendar, which is arbitrary, except other than starting when it started and continuing cyclically. It's set up on a calendar with the principle of Daf Yomi being that if everybody's learning around the world on the same cycle, there's a sort of conversation that can take place and resource sharing that can take place. Mishnah Yomi, which I've been not fully consistently doing in this cycle, but trying to do with Ilan, is not too far from the end of Zra'im, and sometime in the coming year, I think before the end of this year, give or take, we should finish Zra'im and we'll be starting Moed. So for those who are interested in doing some 2 Mishnayot a day, which is a pretty digestible amount of Mishnah to learn on a daily basis, could be done in 5 or 10 minutes. And in this new cycle, there's lots and lots of resources, lots of short, video podcasts, audio podcasts of the content of the Mishnah. Moed is a great place to start because it, has lots of familiar topics to us. We'll definitely be putting out more information about that when we get to Moed in the Mishnah Yomi cycle. And so the Kahati Mishnayot are a great volume, set of volumes to buy, which are available in Hebrew and English. And the All Mishnah, I believe, is the name of the app, which also has great daily Mishnah learning resources. Okay, that's an overview of Mishnayot Masechet Sukkah, which we're going to be learning in the coming weeks. And now I'll pause again if anyone has questions or comments, and I want to sort of dive into an overview of the holiday of Sukkot, which will hopefully give us a kind of thematic framework for approaching the various mitzvot and content. Questions or comments? Don't hesitate. I know I'm bombarding you with a lot this morning. Okay, here we go. I think the next set of our learning will focus on texts which are more familiar to you and hopefully open up some great discussion. Okay, I want to begin now by looking at the way Sukkot is introduced in a couple of sections in the Torah where the holidays are discussed. There's at least 5 places in the Torah where some or all of the biblical holidays are discussed, some shorter passages, some longer. And we're going to look at most of them and see a quick skim and then zero in on the Sukkot section and see how Sukkot seems to stand out. And I've already given you my little teaser that I believe it's the convergence of 2 holiday cycles. So we'll unpack that as we go. We're going to start with the way the holidays are presented in Parashat Emor, in Vayikra. I believe it's chapter 23. And so I'm sharing my screen. We'll go up to the top of the chapter. Here we go. Okay. So quick overview. Hashem spoke to Moshe, a quick skim. Speak to the children of Israel and say, Moadei Hashem asher tikru otam mikrai kodesh eilehem moadai. These are my fixed times, the moadim, that you should proclaim as sacred occasions. And now I just sort of watch in the Hebrew or English, whichever is easier for you. We start with Shabbat. And then we go right into Pesach, starting by Chodesh HaRishon, the first month. Biblical holidays count their month system from the first month being Nisan, being the Exodus from Egypt, because that's the birth month of the Jewish people. So we count our holidays from the birth of our calendar, which was the birth of our nationhood, in Nisan. So we start with Pesach. We have Chag HaMatzot, 7 days long. Then we're told about offering the Omer offering, counting 7 weeks. And at the end of that, bringing a special bread offering. And that is, of course, what's known to us as Shavuot, having a special celebration. It's linked to making sure the needy have enough food because it's the beginning of the harvest festival, the wheat harvest. So that's Pesach and Shavuot. And that now we jump to the 7th month. So we have the first month, the holiday that happens 50 days after the holiday in the first month. And now we jump all the way to the 7th month. 7th month, first day, we have our Blasts holiday. That's Rosh Hashanah. Don't work on that day. 10th day of the 7th month, Day of Atonement. That's Yom Kippur. And then 15th day of this 7th month. Okay, so we've just been continuing through with the holidays in chronological order through the calendar year, starting with Pesach, Shavuot, Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur. Obviously, we can think about holidays we observe today which are missing. They are either post-biblical or post-biblical, but still in the Tanakh in the case of Purim, or in the case of Hanukkah and the modern holidays, even post-canonical Tanakh. So that's why they're not here. And now God continues on to say, state of the children of Israel on the 15th day of the 7th month should be Chag HaSukkot, a 7-day festival. And then we have what sounds like a kind of closing section. Eila Moadei Hashem. These are the set times of Hashem. It bears great similarity to the beginning of the chapter, Moadei Hashem. These are the Moadei Hashem. These are the set times of Hashem. You should celebrate as sacred occasions by bringing burnt offerings, each day what is appropriate to it, apart from the Shabbat and apart from any other offerings that you're going to bring. That should be the end of the section. We mentioned Sukkot, a 7-day festival, and we should be finished. And now, ach, a sort of a strange kind of grammatical term, translated here as mark, or sometimes it's but on the 15th day of the 7th month, when you gather in the yield of your land, observe a festival for 7 days, complete rest on the first day and a complete rest on the 8th day. Strange to have a festival for 7 days, which also has an 8th day. On the first day, you should take the product of hadar trees, branches of palm trees, boughs of leafy trees, and willows of the brook. In Hebrew, pri eitz hadar, kapot tamarim, anaf eitz avot, the arvei nachal, known to us in contemporary times with the words etrog, lulav, hadassim, and aravot, and celebrate, rejoice in front of God for 7 days, celebrate for 7 days. Basukot teshvu shivat yamim, sit in the booths for 7 days, in order that your generations will know that I caused you to, the children of Israel, to dwell in Sukkot when I took them out of Egypt. I am the Lord your God. And then after that, Vaydaber Moshe et Moadei Hashem el bnei Israel. Then, and only then, did Moshe declare these set times of God to the children of Israel. So we have a sort of a strange doubling of the presentation of Sukkot, which doesn't really appear with any of the other holidays. Sukkot is presented in brief with its date here in verses 34, right? You have on the 15th day of the 7th month, Achag HaSukkot, short description of it, 7 days, and then the 8th day is mentioned as well. And then the conclusion of the section in verses 37 and 38. And then we have this sort of circling back to emphasize Sukkot and give a little bit more detail about the special species that are taken on the first day and about the dwelling in Sukkot on that day. It, to me, is unusual for the holidays, and I want to hear your feedback, but I will want to go on a little bit further and kind of build this case. So if you have thoughts about the particular doubling here in Vayikra, let me know. One question came in the chat to me: is there no repetition of the dates for Pesach as there is for Sukkot? Let's go back and take a look. Pesach at the beginning. We're told B'chodesh harishon ba'arba'asar lachodesh bein arba'im Pesach la'Hashem. It's Pesach on the 14th. U'b'chamisha yom lachodesh hazeh Chag HaMatzot. The 15th is Chag HaMatzot, 7 days. And here's what you do on the first day. Here's what you do on the 7th day. And that's it. Then we move on to the Omer and on to Shavuot. So Pesach doesn't seem to have that repetition in the way that Sukkot does. I don't think any of the holidays seem to have that repetition in the way that Sukkot does. Okay, we're going to go on to another place where the holidays appear. That is in Dvarim, Parashat Re'eh, Parashat Shavua, 2 weeks ago. It's a much shorter mention of the holidays. You'll see what's missing. And it begins here. Shamor et Chodesh Aviv. So it doesn't have the same exact structure of here are the holidays, here is the month, and here is the day. But it sort of takes that for granted, which is reasonable. We're in the book of Dvarim. Moshe is repeating and emphasizing selectively various mitzvot and details. So, you know, the holiday of Pesach, the month of Aviv, these are things which have already been described and are known to the Jewish people, and Moshe is now relating to them in a particular way. So observe, be particular to observe the month of Aviv, keep the Pesach, offer the Pesach offering, don't eat any chametz with it, have matzot with it, don't have any leaven in your borders at that time. Various details. 6 days eat matzot. On the 7th day is a stoppage. Then we go on again to counting the 49 days, Shiva Shavuot, 7 weeks you should count. And at the end, you should observe Chag HaShavuot. You should rejoice in front of God at that time. Remember that you were a servant in Egypt and keep all of these statutes. And now, Chag HaSukkot, Ta'aseh Lecha Shivat Yamim. You should observe Chag HaSukkot when you gather in from your threshing floor and your vat. Rejoice in your festival, you, your son and daughter, male and female slave, the Levite, the stranger, the fatherless, and the widow in your communities. 7 days you should hold a festival for the Lord your God in the place God will choose, because God will bless all of your crops and all of your undertakings. You should have nothing but joy. 3 times a year, and now we kind of summarize up. Shalosh pamim bashana, 3 times a year, your men should be seen in the place that God will choose. And we mentioned the holidays again, Chag HaMatzot, Chag HaShavuot, Chag HaSukkot. And then we conclude, everyone should bring their own gift. This one is a little subtler, but what we notice is that Pesach makes no mention of simcha, of joy or celebration. It has the list of things that we're supposed to do, has not eating chametz, yes, eating matzah, no mention of celebration. When we come to Shavuot, we have observing the Chag HaShavuot, v'samachta, and rejoicing before God with you and all of the people in your community. When we come to Sukkot, we seem to have a kind of a double instruction. First is the gathering in from your threshing floor and your vat and rejoicing in your festival in a very similar way to the way Shavuot is described, with the Ger, Yatom, Almana, Levi, your family, your servants, all the people who don't have the economic stability in your gates. This section, I would say, 13 and 14, feels parallel to the Shavuot section. It says, observe the holiday, do it with your family and your community, everyone in your gates, and then it sort of comes to the end. That would be a kind of parallel for Sukkot to Shavuot. But then we have another verse. 7 days you should celebrate with the Lord your God in the place which God has chosen, because God has blessed all of your produce. V'hayita ach sameach, and you should have nothing but joy. This one is a little bit less obvious of a doubling. Maybe it's just a little bit more expansive, but we have this theme of joy repeated twice. It's not mentioned at all on Pesach, and it's mentioned once on Shavuot. And again, we still sort of have these 2 units. We have the unit of kind of community celebration, and then something that's a little bit more kind of personal to you, which is the kind of blessing of your produce. Again, this one is a little bit more speculative, but at least with the doubling of the samachta and v'hayita ach sameach, we have some sense of a kind of a 2x with Sukkot, at least compared to Shavuot, and even much more than we have with Pesach. I would say a doubling of joy with Sukkot compared to Shavuot, and where in Pesach we don't find that at all, and a little bit of just a more expansive language. Okay, I want to make one more point about doubling and then circle back to hear all your thoughts and reactions. Okay, for this we need to look at an entirely different place, which is in Parashat Pinchas. We're not going to look at the verses, but instead we're going to look at a chart which will help us understand the way in which Sukkot serves as a doubling. First, let me pause and ask a question. You can put it in the chat or feel free to unmute. What was missing from the holiday series that we saw in Vayikra and Emor in the first set of verses, which was present there, but missing in the verses that we saw in Parashat Re'eh, just now in Dvarim 16? Which holidays that we saw in the first holiday section were missing in this holiday section?
Shavuos?
We saw Shavuot here. Which ones did we see in Vayikra that we didn't see in Dvarim? Dad, you're muted, but I think you're saying it.
I'm just reading what Bernie said, the 8th day of Sukkot.
Oh, okay, 8th day of Sukkot. Let me go back and see that. Hold on, let me share my screen again. Yep, that's interesting. I wasn't even thinking about that, but that's actually very important. Yeah, the 8th day of Sukkot is not mentioned
How
here.
about Shabbos?
Shabbos, and keep going. What else? Yes, Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, Scott. Thank you. Right. So, so remember that those earlier holidays of the 7th month, Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, the first day of the 7th month and the 10th day of the 7th month, are not mentioned here in Dvarim, and that's not shocking. Again, this is not an earth-shattering revelation, but right, it is the case that we have a system of holidays that we call the Shalosh Regalim, the pilgrimage festivals. That's Pesach, Shavuot, and Sukkot. Those are the times that we kind of set aside to go up to the temple with our offerings. And then we have different ways of thinking about this, but we have Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. And often we think about Sukkot as going along with Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. We might call those the Tishrei holidays, right? We experience them kind of chronologically in succession. And so we group them together, Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, and Sukkot. And they do follow in that series of 3 in the list of holidays of the 7th month in Vayikra, where we saw them in Parashat Emor. But they're, Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur are missing here in Dvarim, not surprisingly, because they're not part of that series of the pilgrimage festivals, which we saw summarized. Shalosh pamim bashana yira'eh kol zechocha. Everybody goes to the temple 3 times a year, not 5 times a year. Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur were not designated as temple holidays per se. So we have Pesach, Shavuot, Sukkot as a cycle where Sukkot is the culminating, or is the 3rd of the 3. And we have Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, Sukkot as the sort of series of Tishrei holidays that we experience in, condensed succession. And therefore, somehow we speculate that they have a relationship, that unit of 3. So there really are kind of 2 units of 3, Pesach, Shavuot, Sukkot, Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, Sukkot, and Sukkot, just thinking about them in that kind of superficial way, and serves as the convergence and culmination of two things. And I want to distill a little bit further, what I think that those 2 cycles and that convergence is about. But we'll see, I think, a really interesting way of seeing that deepened when we look at the offerings that were offered on those holidays. So let me share a different document with you for a moment. Oh, hold on. Disappeared from view. Hold on. Now we got it. Okay, anybody who came to Parsha Shir in summer 2012 might remember this chart 10 years ago. We used to have Parsha Shir before Mincha on Shabbat afternoons at the Bayit. That has not resurfaced post-COVID. And one year on Parashat Pinchas includes in it the sections in which the Torah goes through the holidays by describing the Musaf offerings, the additional offerings that were offered on those holidays. And we get, in that sense, another description or kind of arrangement of the holidays. What that section in Parashat Pinchas sort of lacks is the descriptions of the other mitzvah content of the holidays. Doesn't say much about dwelling in a sukkah or not eating matzah or blowing a shofar. It really just mentions the names of the holidays and then says, here is the offering that was offered. We read these readings as the maftir readings on these holidays in general. So we get sort of a flavor of the special offerings that were offered on those days. So this chart, rather than looking at the psukim, it's easier to look at it in a kind of distilled view with a chart. So the psukim will say, what month of the year is it? What day of the month is it? And then what are the offerings that were offered? So let me try to help us, digest this. We basically see a system of bulls, which is a little bit complicated. Some holidays had 2 parim being offered. Some have 1 par being offered. Sukkot is totally different. On day 1, Sukkot is called, I put here along the left in the first column, not necessarily the names of the holidays that are familiar to us, but the way they are actually called in Parashat Pinchas. So we have the daily offering, Shabbat, Rosh Chodesh, if you can sort of see where my arrow is, Chag HaMatzot, we call that Pesach, Yom HaBikurim, we call that Shavuot. So you can see here we're following basically the Parashat Emor, the Vayikra, the Leviticus arrangement, going essentially chronologically, starting with the first month. So we have Pesach, Shavuot, Rosh Hashanah, which is called Yom Teruah. Yom Kippur never actually gets a name in Parashat Pinchas. It's just called sort of the time when you afflict yourselves, V'initem. But that's Yom Kippur, month 7, day 10. And then Parashat Pinchas calls Sukkot Chag, which is also interesting in its own right, just literally the holiday gives us a sense that it, and that name actually carries through into rabbinic literature, in which Sukkot is also called Chag. So it sort of has a kind of, even just by name, sort of pride of place as almost the ultimate holiday, the holiday. It's also interesting because Chag and Chug in Hebrew has also the sense of circle or cycle. And I want to mention, just as a half an aside, we do a lot of walking in circles on Sukkot. We take the lulav and etrog and we walk around, and those are called hakafot. We often call them hoshanot because the prayers that we say when we do them are called the hoshanot prayers, the save us God prayers, but the actual circling is called hakafot. We then borrow that name for Simchas Torah, the extension of Shmini Atzeret, where we walk in circles with the Torah around the bima. But originally, and we'll see this in the Mishnayot in chapter 4, that the hakafot were done in the temple with the arba minim, with the 4 species, and so there's a circling that we do a lot on Sukkot. The Torah calls Sukkot in a different place Chag HaAsif Tikufat Hashana. It's the holiday of gathering in. It's the festival of gathering at the turn of the year. So Pesach is really associated with, I'm going to make up a word, I think, cyclicality or turning or circles. And what I want to also argue here, both kind of literally and poetically, is that Sukkot kind of closes the circle. It closes the circle of the pilgrimage festivals. Pesach, Shavuot, and Sukkot closes the circle. It closes the circle of the Tishrei festivals. And in sort of doing so, it almost interlocks these 2 circles of holidays. And it's seen as almost the holiday of circles, of walking around in circles. And it's being called Chag, which has an aspect of kind of cycle and circle itself, is I think very significant. So coming back to this chart. So on Sukkot, which is called Chag, which has its 7 days, and then that 8th day, which is sort of its own holiday, the system of bulls is a little bit complex because we start with 13 and we go down to 7. That has a lot of its own significances, which we're not going to explore here. What I want to focus in on is the system of rams, sheep, and goats, elim, kvasim, and seirim. So you see that Chag HaMatzot and Yom HaBikurim, that is to say Pesach and Shavuot, have 1 ram, 7 sheep, and 1 goat. Same with Yom HaBikurim, Shavuot. 1 ram, 7 sheep, and 1 goat. Same with Rosh Hashanah. Same with Yom Kippur. 1 ram, 7 sheep, 1 goat. 1 ram, 7 sheep, 1 goat. So I would expect, just based on this consistent holiday model, we can even go all the way down to Shmini Atzeret. 1 ram, last row, 1 ram, 7 sheep, 1 goat. So I would expect, based on a sort of consistency model, basically all the biblical holidays have 1 ram, 7 sheep, 1 goat, except when we come to Sukkot, where we find 2 rams, 14 sheep, and 1 goat. 2 rams, 14 sheep, and 1 goat. So I don't have an explanation for the goats part, but on the rams and the sheep, what do we see is simply a doubling. Essentially, every day of Sukkot has double the rams and double the sheep of every other holiday. And what I'm far from the first to suggest this, the kind of Gush school of biblical commentators, Rav Menachem Leibtag, Rav Yoni Grossman, and others have argued the lesson to be learned, or the idea that's being expressed in the doubling of the rams and the sheep, is basically that this points to us Sukkot as being a part of 2 holiday systems. So Sukkot is part of the Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur Sukkot system. So it has 1 ram and 7 sheep as part of because it's a Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur Tishrei holiday. And then it also has 1 ram and 7 sheep because it's one of the pilgrimage festivals. It's part of the Pesach Shavuot cycle. So it needs 1 ram and 7 sheep from the pilgrimage festivals, and it needs 1 ram and 7 sheep because it's also a Tishrei holiday. And then those things come together, and that's why we have 2 rams and 14 sheep. So this doubling that we see on Sukkot that we don't see on any other holiday, again, brings home to us the idea that there is an aspect of kind of doubling that Sukkot represents by its being a part of 2 holiday systems. Let me say one more thing and then I'll open up. Thank you for indulging me with a lot of front loading. So we also see 2 central mitzvot that are expressed on Sukkot. One is the Arba Minim, one is the 4 species, which, if we think about them very simply, they are kind of produce of the land of Israel. In the holiday, which is a holiday of ingathering, of gathering our produce, we have all this verdant, beautiful produce which we gather in. And we have the observance of dwelling in the Sukkah. And the Torah tells us explicitly exactly what that's about. I'm going to go back to our very first source for a moment and share my screen again. So the first mitzvah, the taking of the species, which I'm arguing sort of has to do with it being the holiday, the agricultural celebration of the harvest. So we collect all these verdant harvested things from the fields. And here we have the, usmachtem lifnei Hashem, that rejoicing, which is very much associated, going back to what we saw in Devarim. The rejoicing is very much associated with the harvest. In fact, one argument for why there is no joy referenced on Pesach, some joy referenced on Shavuot, and double joy referenced on Sukkot is because only on Sukkot have we been able to collect whatever we can from our harvest. And whatever we have hopefully sufficient to celebrate. At any previous point, we have the anxiety of not yet knowing what we'll be able to collect. And so the increase in joy relates to these sort of agricultural seasons. And so the usmachtem lifnei Hashem Elokechem, the rejoicing, has to do with the agricultural dimension of the holiday. Then we're told to dwell in Sukkot. Leman yedu dorotechem ki basukot hoshavti et bnei Yisrael v'hotzii otam me'eretz Mitzrayim ani Hashem Elokechem. You dwell in Sukkot for 7 days in order that all generations know that I caused the children of Israel to dwell in Sukkot when I took them out of the land of Egypt. I am the Lord your God. This is, and again, some of these ideas may be familiar to you from many other shiurim in the Bayit or outside. This is the historical dimension of the holidays. In particular, Pesach, Shavuot, and Sukkot each commemorate historical moments that are, linked to really the first, although Sukkot emphasizes all 40, the first year of the Exodus from Egypt. Pesach commemorates the Exodus itself. Shavuot, and this is a more complicated rabbinic sort of expansion of the idea, but Shavuot, as we observe it today, comes to also commemorate the receiving of the Torah, the arrival at Sinai, which is the first stage of the culmination of the Exodus from Egypt. And then Sukkot comes to commemorate the entirety of our wandering in the wilderness and God's sort of protection and sheltering us over that time. So these sort of the generation of the bulk of the Torah, the generation of the the Exodus and the wilderness. That's in some ways 2 generations, but that 40-year period from Exodus to arriving at the border of the land of Israel is a very important, concrete historical era, which so much of our Jewish textual and historical identity is built upon. That there is a series of 3 holidays which sort of builds itself in large part around those historical moments. They also, in many ways, build themselves around this agricultural cycle. So we have, even within the pilgrimage festivals themselves, this dual nature of agriculture and history. The Tishrei holidays are a little bit less clear in the Torah. They don't make reference to historical moments, and they are too condensed to be a kind of an expansive agricultural progression, but they clearly are their own condensed series of holidays. Are they somehow a series of commemorations of the end of the agricultural cycle? Are they a different set of historical commemorations? That's much less clear, and the Torah is much more terse about them. But I think we have sufficient biblical data to see that there are kind of 2 related pairings. There is the pilgrimage festivals, which have both a historical and an agricultural dimension. So we sort of carry historical and agricultural, and those are both combined within the pilgrimage festivals. And then alongside them, we have the Tishrei festivals, whose nature and identity is a little bit less clear. We just have Rosh Hashanah as the shofar blast day, Yom Kippur as the day of affliction and atonement. I think we experience them now really as kind of the spiritual, for lack of a better term, the spiritual introspective kind of season. It's not exactly clear whether that was the Torah's vision of them in its time, but they're their own sort of cycle. And somehow Sukkot winds up encompassing all of it. It has the agricultural as being the holiday of gathering in and that unique dimension of joy. And I think that's primarily expressed by the Arba Minim, the 4 species. It has the historical by being the recollection of the dwelling and God's protection in the wilderness, and that's expressed through the mitzvah of Sukkah. And then it also has the culmination of the Tishrei holidays. And we see that through the fact that it has its doubling of korbanot, its double mention, its sort of placement both in the pilgrimage festival only section in Dvarim and its place in Vayikra and in Pinchas with the Tishrei holidays. And so clearly it's built into that cycle. And so it has this series of pairings and kind of interlocking circles that I think give it a really, really unique place. I want to say a couple of closing comments that'll bring us back to the Mishnayot themselves, but I want to pause for questions, comments, reactions, pushback to this kind of thesis and framework. Dad, please.
The word v'chol was used in describing the harvest in the section on Sukkot. So it said all of your harvests. So it seems to me that's not just the harvest of Sukkot. It includes the harvest of the barley and the harvest of wheat. So it includes the second day of Pesach, Shavuot, and all of Sukkot. So it combines all of the pilgrimage festivals. And one other thing I noticed, I always thought that the song we sing on Simchas Torah, V'samachta b'chagecha v'yisach sameach, I always thought that was a verse of its own. But clearly, V'samachta b'chagecha is the first phrase of a pasuk, and ach sameach is the last phrase of the following pasuk. So it's in a way, as bookends, Sukkot has its own internal circle. it's to identify it as a holiday of circles. So just a couple observations.
Beautiful, beautiful. Yeah, I like that reading of Bechol Tevuatecha, all of your grain. And I don't know. I'm sure there were Sukkot rituals that are lost to us now. That I wonder. I don't know whether I could totally envision. I don't know, preserving some barley, preserving some wheat, and somehow bringing them back in. I mean, we even the idea of having kind of hanging fruits in our sukkah, I think evokes that sense of the harvest festival and kind of collecting up, not just the most recent, but collecting up bits of what we harvested from across the year and kind of displaying that in the sukkah. So it has, again, exactly as you said, not just the sense of recency or immediacy, but the sense of culmination and cumulativity, and making up lots of words here, cumulativity, of that whole cycle. And yes, there's a big ellipsis in that, but it is a common misconception that it is a pasuk, but it is those two fragments, and I think you described it beautifully, how then it builds that in that bookend way, a kind of an internal circle for Sukkot. So it's beautiful. Great. Other comments? Just going back to gallery view so I can see everyone. Stymied, convinced, befuddled. Maybe some of this is familiar to you already. Again, feel free to continue to digest it and share feedback, Bernie. Great.
Would you give a quick summary of what you think the significance of the doubling is?
Great. Now you put me on the spot with the obviously important question. The significance of the doubling. Well, so maybe I'll ask you to clarify any particular doubling, meaning the textual doubling, the korban doubling, or just the whole thesis that Sukkot. So I guess I'll try to restate, and maybe you'll tell me what's missing. I think that to me, the doubling, the textual doubling, the korban doubling, the purpose of it is to highlight to us Sukkot's place in these two cycles. In other words, so that we recognize
Aria,
sits.
Can you come here for a minute, please?
Sits at the nexus of and fits into these two cycles. I think it's just to highlight to us, maybe I'll say it this way, the doubling highlights to us Sukkot's dual nature. Now, again, it's a little tricky here and imperfect in this sense because all the pilgrimage festivals, I would argue, have two aspects to them, the historical and the agricultural. So there's sort of two different dualities that we're playing with. What I want to argue about Sukkot is that it has that like the other pilgrimage festivals, but it also sits in the Tishrei holidays. I've done a much less good job, and I haven't invested the time here to try to argue what the theme or aspect of the Tishrei holidays is, because Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur don't seem to have an agricultural aspect or a historical Exodus related aspect in the way that the pilgrimage festivals do. So I think the pilgrimage festivals are much better explicated, and they have their own duality. But putting all of that in one box, pilgrimage festivals, which have agricultural and historical within them, Sukkot is in there. The Tishrei holidays are much less well explicated, but Sukkot is in there too. So all the doublings of Sukkot are to help us highlight that it sits in and is the culmination of two different holiday cycles, the pilgrimage festival holiday cycle and the Tishrei festival holiday cycle. Maybe part of what's sort of confusing or less clear here is that I haven't spelled out what the nature of the Tishrei holiday cycle is, because it's much less clear in the Torah. But so all the doublings are to help us see that Sukkot is part of both of those cycles. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. I'm just wondering, from that doubling, can we infer any special significance to Sukkot and importance to Sukkot itself?
Yeah, great. So if anything, I think that's first to say that's the right question. I don't have a simple answer other than somehow, to argue for this is, I guess I would try to make this case for every holiday, but I think somehow the Torah wants us to experience on Sukkot an intensification, something of an intensified experience of kind of sitting in and again, it's also, I think it's significant that it's the culmination of both the cycles, right? We could have imagined that, somehow the Torah presented it as, again, this would just be a radically different arrangement, but if it were to be Pesach, Sukkot, Shavuot somehow, and Rosh Hashanah, Sukkot, Yom Kippur, and Sukkot was sort of the middle of each of those things, obviously at the same time. If the calendar was laid out in a different way, such that it was the middle of them, it would feel like a different experience. It would feel like two parallel chains with a link in the middle. But here I see it as like two things where the link comes at the apex or at the vertex. I don't know. So it's this sort of experience of two processes that are culminating simultaneously. And so I think the experience on Sukkot is just in whatever way to carry that awareness of the duality, that intensification. It's certainly expressed in the Torah with the sense of double joy. And again, I think I would say the way I think we experience that kind of at a simple level is, and we don't experience the agricultural dimension that much anymore, but hopefully the sense of bounty at the end of the harvest season and the sense of release at the end of the tshuva season. I think that's sort of what experientially that kind of the duplication somehow, hopefully, ideally, material and spiritual success and fulfillment is kind of the ultimate pairing or doubling that I think is I'm thinking about.
Nice. And added to that is the immersive nature of being in the Sukkah.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. Right. There's something that's so much more all encompassing about Sukkot than any other holiday. So almost physically, experientially, that's the case. Great. I want to make a couple of other. Vivian, go ahead. About time.
I was thinking in the calendar that Sukkot. There's a very long gap between Sukkot and the next holiday, which would be Pesach, a half year. Like all the holidays are condensed within 1.5 year, and then you have to wait another half year and go through winter and spring and all that before you get to Pesach. So maybe you have to make a big impact. Maybe that's why everything is doubled.
Yes.
And you need a big impact.
Yes, that's a beautiful insight. I agree wholeheartedly. I think that's part of the idea of Shmini Atzeret, which, how exactly does that fit in is an interesting question, which the rabbis struggle with mightily. But that idea of that one more day, because I think it's actually very beautiful. Maybe I'll offer this little thought about Shmini Atzeret, right? The rabbis have this midrash about God saying, just stay with me for one more day. So there's actually two dimensions of the stay with me for one more day. One dimension is because I've gotten so accustomed to being with you. How have I gotten so accustomed to being with you? We spent the whole 7th month together, right? That's the aspect of the Tishrei holidays. The other is because I know it's going to be so long until we're going to be together again. Why is it so long till we're going to be together again? Because it's the end of the pilgrimage festival cycle, which you're talking about. We're not going to be together again until Pesach. So Shmini Atzeret, as the kind of postscript to Sukkot, has really the wanting to linger together, because it's been the end of this intensive Tishrei series, and also because it's going to be so long till the Pesach series. So I think it's a beautiful, beautiful point. Thank you. Yeah, so like trying to live in the consciousness of that is what, that kind of intensification of Sukkot is all about. Joyce, go ahead.
Yeah, I was going to say exactly that midrash, actually, but also the piece about just that with how much time we've been spending, let's say in Tishrei, that because it has been so intense, in some ways, Sukkot kind of still is a little bit. It's not quite as intense, but it has even a more joyous component than the Yamim Noraim.
Yeah,
that allows us to say, okay, we made it through another year. We're starting another year, and we can do this.
Yes, yeah, and sort of creating that. This coming back to Bernie's point, the sukkah is like a container for just sort of being gives us a little more breathing room. It's the ritual which kind of literally is a container. It's not, the Arba Minim is a different thing. We have a lot we have to do with it. Sukkot is just be in it. So that has its own kind of breathing room, joy kind of dimension. So that's great. Let me make a couple of very quick closing comments because we're past time. So just as, I wanted to offer this, to stand on its own, but also as an introduction to Mishnayot Masechet Sukkah, because as we go through, hopefully these are some things like some little talking points, bullet points to keep with you as you experience the topics. Again, I've sort of made the argument that the Sukkah is a little bit more related to the historical commemoration than the agricultural, but you'll see, you'll be able to think about what are the sources and meanings and purpose of the mitzvah of Sukkah, which we'll hit first, then the Arba Minim. When we come to the end, as I mentioned, kind of the Sukkah itself sort of disappears, and we are still talking about the Arba Minim. Part of that, I think, has to do with the fact that the emphasis of the end of the tractate is the role of the Beit HaMikdash. So how does the Beit HaMikdash interplay with the Sukkah? Does the Sukkah sort of fall away in the presence of the Beit HaMikdash? We bring our Arba Minim to the Beit HaMikdash. We sort of the Sukkah falls away. In the absence of the Beit HaMikdash, the Sukkah's sort of importance rises again. I think that's sort of one little thing to think about. There's a final convergence, which I'll just touch on very, very lightly. If you have a chance to look into or get Professor David Moster's book on the etrog, he goes into this at length. But it's amazing to note in the book of Nehemiah, when Sukkot was being celebrated by the returning exiles, just going to share my screen for one last moment. Anyone who needs to jump off, no problem. The people gathered in Nehemiah chapter 8, people gathered, they asked Ezra to read the Torah scroll. And on the first day of the 7th month, this is Rosh Hashanah, he does a big reading from the Sefer Torah. It's sort of really interesting in its own right. They learn a lot about, what's in it, and people weep they realizing they haven't observed all the words of the Torah. Ezra tells them, don't be sad, rejoice. And then they go and they get ready because they find they're reading the Torah, and what do they see? There's a holiday called Sukkot they have to observe that's coming up. They get everybody ready, and what's the announcement? Ya'aviru kol b'chol areihem of Yerushalayim, proclaim all through the cities and Jerusalem to say, go out to the mountains, bring leafy branches of olive trees, pine trees, myrtles, and other leafy trees, alei tamarim, that's really lulav, kapot tamarim, anaf eitz avot, that's sounds similar to the hadassim, la'asot sukkot, kakatuv. Now, there's two different ways we could translate that. We could say, in order to observe the holiday of Sukkot as was written, meaning Sukkot is the harvest festival, go harvest some things, or on Sukkot, we need some of the 4 species, so go get some of those 4 species. But the JPS translated probably the way it should be correctly translated, which is to make booths. And indeed, the people went out and they made booths. And what did they make them out of? They roofed them and maybe even built them out of these things. So there's actually in Nehemiah some sort of convergence between the Arba Minim and the construction of the Sukkot. So sort of the two mitzvot kind of come together in a fascinating way. There's a lot more that needs to be said about that, but I'll just leave that as a teaser, that maybe the Arba Minim in some way become the Sukkah, and there's a whole historical tradition to that as well. The Sukkah the original Sukkah, and this is hinted at in the other Psukim in Nevi'im, the original Sukkah might have been the watchman's booth in the fields that the watch person would stay in during the harvest season to make sure that things were not stolen or, rained on overly or whatever it is. So the Sukkah has many links to the harvest season, and the Arba Minim may have a link to the Sukkah as well. So a lot of these ideas converge in these interlocking circles, and hopefully we'll get a chance to delve into that more as we go through our series of learning session by session. Bert had just messaged me to make a comment about the fact that Monday the 19th, I'll be learning with our Bert's Monday Chabura, and it's also the YCT and partner institutions Yemei Iyun. That is not a personal conflict for me. I will be available to teach irrespective of the Yemei Iyun taking place. So if the group still wants to meet that day, great. If folks want to reschedule because of the Yemei Iyun, let me know. But I am available to teach that day and that time, irrespective of the Yemei Iyun, but don't want to create conflict for anyone else. So feel free to circle back with me.
That's great. So far, there's been only one person that mentioned that was, so if you record, the conversation, he'll listen to that.
Sure.
So far, there's only one person who was doing the Yemei Iyun. And, I usually do the Yemei Iyun, but I don't find this topics quite as compelling this year for whatever reason. So we'll see you both on the 12th and the 19th at 11:30.
Great.
Okay.
Great.
Okay, thank you.
All right. Thanks to everyone. A wonderful day. Welcome back into the holiday season and look forward to see everybody soon. Make your Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur reservations if you haven't yet. The office is available to help. And as always, great to be together. Love to mom and dad. Love to all. Have a great day.
Thank you.
Bye.
Yeah.